along with some committee members, one of which we have here, Dan Gutierrez, if anybody knows him. But I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Deputy Commissioner Ron Carlson, and then followed by Commissioner John Salazar to talk about some important issues here in Colorado. And so without further ado, Ron?
Well, thank you very much, Becky, and hopefully everybody can hear me. I'm going to project out as loud as I can, and also I want to acknowledge that we have a fair number of our FFA students here today, and you know, these guys represent the future of ag leadership in Colorado, and so thank you guys for coming by and visiting with us, and hopefully leave you with some useful information that you can carry back with you. But today we're going to talk about water, and we're going to kind of divide it up a bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are now, review the bidding as to where we are now, how we got here, and then we'll take a little more forward-looking approach in the second part of the presentation. But talking about water, and statewide, if you look at the entirety of the state, we're really talking about lack of water this year. Or last year, as you know, this past year we suffered through one of the worst droughts that we've seen in years. We saw that really developing last winter when we saw that the average snowpack around the state was much less than it normally should have been. Then we had a warmer than usual spring in large parts of the state, and early melt, and then went through the summer and fall with just you know, very little precipitation around most of the state. You know, this led to some challenging situations around Colorado with regard to drought, with regard to production. You know, through most of this, well, starting in early summer, right up through the rest of the year, and even to the very present, our state has been designated as entirely being in drought. The entire state is registered by the drought monitor. And as I said, those conditions continue. But as we saw last year, some of the challenges that occurred included, well, this is a hay and forage program. The price of hay, for example, became very expensive and very scarce. As we got through the summer, the price of hay, if you could find it, was beginning to skyrocket, tripling in some cases. We saw the price of feed otherwise being very expensive, and this had a very detrimental impact on livestock producers, on dairy, as they saw the price of their inputs go up significantly. So that was a bit of a challenge. We saw some response from the federal government in that Secretary Vilsack declared pretty much all of Colorado as a drought disaster area, which made the state eligible, and a lot of the producers in the state eligible for some level of assistance, usually low-interest loans and the like. We saw CRP acreage in parts of the state opened up for haying and grazing. You know, a lot of that helped, but it was really just a drop in the bucket. The Secretary of Agriculture really has limited tools right now with which to help address some of the drought situation. We have a one-year extension of the Farm Bill, and unfortunately that one-year extension didn't provide a lot of assistance to help with the drought situations. A lot of the livestock disaster assistance programs, for example, were reauthorized. That is, they were allowed to continue operating for the remainder of the year, but they weren't funded. So, not particularly helpful. And there was the SURE program, the Supplemental Revenue Payments program was not continued at all. So we faced a lot of challenges as we went through the year. Now we're into a new year, And a concern that a lot of us have is that, unfortunately, the drought does not seem to be abating very much. In fact, the entire state continues to be listed as being in drought conditions, whether that be moderate to severe to extreme to exceptional. We're still facing those conditions throughout the state. And while we've seen some snow here over the last couple of days in the mountains, and we'll take anything we can get at this point, most of the basins throughout the state continue to be below average in snowpack, anywhere from 60 to 70%. I think there are a couple of basins that have gotten a little bit above that, but all of the basins are below average in their snowpack. We need to see some more consistent patterns in the mountains where we're seeing that snowpack develop, where we're seeing, snowfall every few days, some good snow to help build up that snowpack so we can have some good runoff, some good spring melt as we get into the season. But right now, we're still below average, and the forecasts aren't particularly promising. Now, I think you're going to have a presentation tomorrow from Nolan Doskin, who is with Colorado State University, and if you're able to see that, I encourage you to do so. He'll get much more into the weeds with regard to some of the climate issues, what the conditions are now, and what the expectations are in the coming months and even the coming years. So I'd encourage you to see Nolan's presentation as well. We continue to have quite a precipitation deficit. Soil moisture is down. As I said, snowpack is down. Secretary Vilsack, January the 9th, declared 30 counties in Colorado as drought disastrous areas. And whenever you have a drought designation for a particular county, the counties around it will get included in that, as well as contiguous counties. So overall, there were 43 counties declared as drought disaster assistance areas. That includes Weld County area as well. And what that meant is that, again, producers with losses would be eligible for low interest loans to help them recover for some of their losses. Again, without some additional assistance in a farm bill, the Secretary is fairly limited in what he can do. We have, I know the Department of Agriculture have been part of the Drought Task Force, which involves the Governor's Office, the Colorado Water Conservation Board, the Department of Natural Resources, and some other folks since last year. And we continue to work and to look for ways that we can respond, to look for ways that we can seek help to let there be light. Now let there be rain.
That's a big light, I can't make it.
Well, I could ask. But we'll continue to work as part of the task force to figure out responses and to try to help mitigate in whatever way we can to the drought. Again, we're somewhat limited in what we can do. One of the other things I forgot to mention with regard to the drought last year, and I mentioned some of the responses, opening up of CRP acreage and the like. Another thing is that Governor Hickenlooper issued a waiver. I think it covered 2 or 3 months in the fall to allow shipments of hay to come in that were over size. There are limits on Colorado roads as to the size of height restrictions and that could travel in the state. Governor Hickenlooper issued a waiver so we could get some relief and get some of that extra hay coming in. But it's been a difficult winter. Some of our producers in livestock and dairy having some difficulty, particularly stocking up for the winter. And so it's going to, I'm afraid, has been leading to some situations where they're having to consider about the size of their herds going forward. There have been some sell-offs last fall. Some producers were selling off sooner than they wanted to, maybe culling their herds where they really didn't want to. And if this drought continues, this lack of water continues, we're going to see some more very difficult and challenging decisions in the future as well. So we've got some issues with the lack of water. We've got some real challenges that we're going to have to address, and of course some of this could address itself if we would just begin to get the precipitation we need, the snow in the mountains this winter. But the precipitation deficit, or the moisture deficit, has been so severe that pretty much everyone has been saying that we're going to need to have a better than average precipitation year this year in order to make up some of that deficit and to meet some of the challenges that we've got coming up in agriculture for the coming year. And we'll see where that goes and how the rest of the winter proceeds. But this is kind of where we are. This is where we find ourselves right now in trying to address these challenges and trying to deal with the consequences and the impacts that the lack of precipitation has had with Colorado agriculture. Well, we have to look to both the coming year, but even beyond that. We have to think about, not just this year. It's going to rain at some point. We may have some good years coming up where we have lots of precipitation. But we may have more of these cycles where we have limited precipitation, where we have drought or drought-like conditions. And that's going to be an interesting situation considering some of the challenges ahead with regard to population growth, with regard to competing demands for water between agricultural users and metropolitan area users or municipal users. Those competing demands are only going to grow. And how are we going to meet those needs in the future? How are we going to make sure that water is left in the land for our agricultural users? How are we going to ensure that we have the capability, we have the production ability to meet what's going to be a growing need? And Commissioner Salazar is going to get a little bit more into that, looking to the future. Commissioner John Salazar has served our state with honor and distinction. First 2-year term as a state representative in Denver, then 3 terms in the United States House of Representatives, and since January of 2011 has been serving Colorado as the Commissioner of Agriculture. So with that, I'm going to turn it over for the rest of our presentation to Commissioner John Salazar.
You know, the hardest thing to do is to speak right after lunch. And I saw a few faces starting to nod, but we're going to wake you up. We're going to wake you up because water is a very important topic. We all drink it, right? I have a great presentation for you, and I think you'll all enjoy it because it kind of outlines the issues and how we have to plan for the future. And then after that, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the governor is planning to do to try to help us develop a 50-year water plan for the state of Colorado. Can everybody see? This is a little report and presentation that was actually done by the Colorado Land Trust, Conservation Trust, which talks about energy, food needs, recreation needs, water needs. And we asked the commission to be able to use it because it's a very, very good presentation as to what's going to happen in Colorado if we're not careful. So let's see. We want to thank, of course, the Colorado Land Conservation Trust staff for helping us put this together. And we want to, in the end, we'll see who we have to recognize for helping put this. Okay. We will be actually growing by about 3 million new citizens within the next 20 years. And that's equivalent to the size of Chicago. Okay? So we will grow from today, we're right at 5 million close to a little, right over 8 million by the year 2040. Colorado's population will actually grow faster than the United States population in the next 30 years. And most of the growth will actually come from in-migration. And guess where the growth is going to take place? You guys are all live along the Front Range, and that's where the population growth is going to take place. At least 80% of people coming into Colorado. And can everybody hear us? Look at this. Interesting facts. This comes from the state demographer. 11 counties will double their population by 2040, including all of these counties. And the biggest ones, of course, these are the ones that will be changing close to 200% of population. Are any of you in there? Yeah. Okay, Colorado will need an additional, this is the important thing that we're going to get to. Colorado will need an additional 190,000 to 630,000 acre-feet of water just for the population growth. And that's actually more water than what is provided by the largest water provider in the state of Colorado, which is Denver Water. Scary, huh? Is it possible to meet that demand? They've done it in Australia. Did you know that the per capita water usage here in Colorado is about 170 gallons per day per person? This says 121, but I've seen other figures. In Australia, they've lowered that to 36 gallons a day per person. So where do you think that water is going to come? That's a hard face truth. I mean, a hard thing to face. But what happens is because agriculture has made water available at a very inexpensive rate, that's where people will come to take water from, is agriculture. So, think about this. Colorado's ag land shrank by 7.4 million acres between 1950 and 2010. And if they continue to target ag land for additional water, Colorado will lose an additional 3 million acres in the next 10 years. That's equivalent to about 3,500 average-sized Colorado farms and ranches. So as demand for land contributes to significant land appreciation, which you've seen over the last, from 2000 to 2011, land values have gone up by 72%. Look what's happening to our young farmers. It's gone down by 30%. Heck, you know, I don't consider myself old anymore because I'm the average age of a farmer. I'm 60 years old. The average age of farmers, not only in Colorado, but across the country, is about 59. Okay, so transferring water to meet demand in growing urban areas could dry up between 500 and 700,000 acres. I know that down in the Rio Grande Basin, I got a pointer here as well. This is where I live. This is the San Luis Valley. We're very stingy with our water. Many of you have heard about the big water fights that we have faced in the past few years. We've had over $40 million that has been spent in legal fees, fighting people, water speculators who want to dry up some of ag land and move the water over to the urban areas. And of course, there's always this fight between the western slope and the Front Range. There's people on the western slope where much of the water comes from, they want to protect their water. And if you look at the Colorado River, for example, they're barely meeting their demand. As a matter of fact, the Colorado River is already over-appropriated. So any time that you take more water out of the western slope to the Front Range, what ends up happening is something has to give. Look at them. These are very important figures. Colorado's agriculture contributes over $40 billion to the state's economy. In 24 Colorado counties, 1 in 10 jobs is tied to the ag and food industry. And globally, in the next 50 years, we will have to produce as much food as has been produced in the last 10,000 years combined. Another important piece of information, 37,000 farms and ranches in Colorado. They cover nearly half the state's total land area. Okay, but on the bright side, despite enduring one of the harshest droughts in more than 50 years, Colorado's ag industry has fared remarkably well in 2012, with net farm income projected at $1.44 billion. This is net farm income, not gross. A level some $120 million less than last year because of the drought. But still the second highest on record. 2013, this is the economic forecast for 2013. It's expected to be the 8th time in the last 10 years that Colorado net farm income and ranch income will surpass $1 billion, a level that was first exceeded in 2004. According to the National Ag Statistics Service report, the 2012 average value of cropland in Colorado was $1,450 an acre, up 8.2% from 2011, 63% increase over the 2004 value of land. Exports in Colorado food and ag products have never been higher and expected to top $2 billion in 2013. And of course, ongoing efforts with the government, U.S. government, to expand market access for beef exports to China and Japan. As many of you know, Japan has lifted the restriction and now will accept animals up to 30 months old. Mexico holds a huge potential for importation of potatoes. The U.S. government, the governor, myself, have been working on trying to gain access to shipment of fresh market potatoes into the interior part of Mexico. That could add an additional $30 million to the state's economy. So, if you look at this chart, what you will see is that your net farm income forecast for 2013 is going to be right around $2 billion, up quite a bit. The highest it's ever been was this year, which was 1.6, almost 1.7, and that was in 2011. We went down some in 2012 due to the drought. We're hoping to be up around $2 billion. Every single forecast that I have seen from the U.S. Department of Agriculture shows that agriculture is really a key economic driver in the United States and actually is going to be key to recovering from this recession. So I just wanted to thank all of these folks who helped us put this presentation together. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is because who's always the target? Agriculture, right? 2% of the population in this country live on farms and ranches. We do not have much of a voice. I don't know if all of you have heard. The latest attack on agriculture, of course, is by HSUS. And they're trying to push a bill through the House of Representatives right now in Colorado to ban tail docking of dairy cattle in Colorado. And I say, you know, there's already resolutions that have been passed by the Dairy Association, by the Livestock Care Committee that I was able to put together, so that we can actually become a proactive voice instead of a reactive voice to situations like this. And so I say, if people are really interested in animal welfare, in the humane treatment of animals, why don't we just ban tail docking of pets, puppies, and everything else? Serious. If that's really the reason that they want to push this forward. But you know that wouldn't happen, because they have a much bigger audience that they have to fight. And they pick on agriculture because there's very few of us. So I ask you one favor. Regardless whether you're a commodity grower, regardless whether you're a livestock producer, the key thing for our survival, not only in this state, but in this country, is to speak with one voice. And what speaks more than anything else to people is the almighty dollar sign. In this country, we are the most efficient producers of food. And for the consumers that only spend 6 to 7% of their disposable income on food, other countries spend 40 to 60% of their disposable income on food. But we all have to speak with one voice and show the American public how important it is that American agriculture is, not only because everybody eats, right? How important American agriculture is, because it's also a matter of national security. It's a matter of trying to keep people well fed, because as long as you keep people's bellies full, you keep them satisfied. So, we're a very vulnerable population because there's so few of us in this country. So anyway, we'll turn it back to water. I know that many of you are here because you're very interested in what could possibly happen this next year, legislatively, and what the governor and what power he's got to be able to do things. You know, we were instrumental in pushing the governor to sign House Bill 1278 because of the issues that you have along the South Platte. And one of the key things that I know that we had a big conference here a few months back on the Groundwater Alliance, and we talked about how we could actually try to figure out a way to find out where we could actually find more efficient water storage. When you talk about water storage, most people think of above ground storage reservoirs, right? Above ground storage reservoirs. You're awake now, aren't you? Yeah. Above ground water storage is actually the most inefficient way that you can store water. The most efficient storage that you can find anywhere in the world is your underground reservoirs. And I'm hoping that House Bill 1278, the governor signed into law, which helped fund a study along the South Platte, can actually give us some answers in how we can actually give the state engineer a little more authority to be able to manage our rivers by utilizing underground water storage and above ground water storage, and try to figure out a better way, a more efficient way, so that in times of surplus, like we had in 2011, when there was so many 400,000 acre feet is what I've heard, gone into Nebraska, that we never got credit for, there was some way that we could actually store that and be able to utilize in drought years like last year, I think would be a great, great story. There's no easy answers. As you know, Colorado has the largest number per capita of water attorneys than any other state in the entire country. Now, I'm not slamming attorneys, right, Chuck? But that's a fact. You know, you and I can sit in a room, sitting across the table, and we could hammer out a compromise for it could be a win-win situation, but you get one water attorney that walks into the room and both of us will be fighting. And that's basic reality, it really is. So with that, what we ought to do is to have a little time to open it up for questions, and we'll try to answer whatever we can. You know, we're lucky to have Ron Carlton, who spent 30 years in Washington, D.C., and so he knows the ins and outs of the Farm Bill. He worked on, I think, 6 different Farm Bills during his career there. And so, also, I just want to say one quick thing. Bob Hamlin, a good friend of mine, just retired from Census service. Let's give him a round of applause for his service.
Gary Sheffer, I'm from north of New Raymond. A lot of people have a misconception about Colorado water. The water belongs to Colorado.
It's true.
We have rights to use it. And so my concern is most of the legislature, or all of the legislature, is made up of people that aren't in agriculture. And so if you continue to work with developers, we're never going to get anywhere. And I think the thing that's important is the statement that you made earlier, all new wealth comes from the land. And I think Colorado has forgotten that. I think Washington, D.C. has forgotten that. If you want to balance budgets and create and get our economy going, you've got to look at where new wealth comes from.
You're absolutely right. And you know, I'm a product of what I think gave me the tools to be able to serve you at the public level and serve agriculture. Kerry Wickstrom, raise your hand. And of course Bob Hamlin, and I don't know if there's anybody else in this room who's gone through the Colorado Ag Leadership Program. I was a graduate of Class 3, and that basically taught me how government works, and that's what interested me in not so much in politics. I actually hate politics. I don't like politics. But I love policy and I love to help people. And my passion is agriculture. And so there's very few voices. When I was in Washington, there was 4 members out of 435 that were still actively engaged in agriculture. And you have all of these other people that are actually creating farm policy that is going to affect your bottom line, and they know absolutely nothing about agriculture. At the state level, right now, in the House and the Senate, we only have 2 people that are actually farming. So that's what I'm saying. So the Ag Leadership Program was a program that actually had died. Due to the lack of funding and lack of interest, it actually died. And Representative Sonnenberg and I put our heads together, and with the help of some of the alumni, we were able to revive that program. We have 31 new students, all from agriculture in one way or another, whether they're production agriculture or ag-related businesses, and a few folks from USDA. And this is supposed to give folks an understanding of how government works in this country and in this world. And so we want to invite you all to meet our new class of 31 new members, very diverse group. We will have them and present them at the Ag Forum on February 14th at the Renaissance Hotel in Denver. We appreciate if you come and join us so that you can get to meet them as well. But that's the only way we're going to get more representation at the federal level, at the state level, is to get people prepared for that. You see our young folks here, they're learning. You know, this is a leadership program for you guys. Take advantage of it, and let's get our voices heard. You're right.
Gerald Roth, Farms Ranch, about 7 miles. We have 9 irrigation wells to fill. Farm about 700 acres. Got a lot of surface water, but not enough to irrigate 700 acres. I guess my question is, how are we going to feed 3 million more people when we'll have less land and water?
How are we going to feed 3 million new people here in Colorado if we only have a limited amount of water? Well, of course, one of our biggest challenges is to stretch every water droplet. There's been irrigation efficiencies that have been created in the state that have made us one of the most efficient production states. I mean, for example, we have some of the most productive dairy cattle in the entire world here in the state of Colorado. We have some of the most productive farmers. I've been to Israel and in areas that are very, very, I guess they have a lot less, very arid, and a lot less water than we have here in Colorado. drip irrigation system was actually developed there. So irrigation efficiency is going to be key, and trying to figure out how we can use and reuse water. You know, when we talk about what's happened in the state, if you look at the growth along the Front Range, you've seen the population expand outward. Okay? And you've seen it actually gobble up farmland. Good, rich farmland. And for me, that's a shame. That's a real shame because we're not really using land use planning the way it should be used. For example, we could house 3 million new inhabitants in Colorado if we planned upwards. In other words, grow up instead of out. Anytime that you put people in condominiums or in apartment buildings, you actually reduce your water consumption by about 80%. And if you invest in new technology, as they have in Israel, for example, they've done it in the space station, for example, you know, they don't take tankers of water because they don't have augmentation plans to get them up there. But anyway, they don't take tankers of water up there. Anytime I talk to the astronauts, and they talk about how every single H2O molecule is actually, you know, even the condensation on the ceiling, the sweat, you know, coming from your body, is actually recycled, gathered, and recycled, and recleaned. And so if you build in such a way where you can have water reuse plans, water should never be a restriction of growth, in other words. As long as you have the technology, if you're willing to invest in technology, that water can be used over and over and over and over again to infinity. The only time that water's gone is when you use it consumptively. Yeah, if you use it for golf courses, lawns, you know, it uses, right? And it's gone. But if you use it to wash dishes, put it through some type of filtration system, and it comes out, you know, drinking quality again. You drink it, and then you know where you go, and you send it down the river. Somebody else picks it up and uses it for something else. So that should not be an issue. But you're right, you know, it's going to be irrigation efficiency that's going to drive, you know, our food production systems here. And I've seen it already. I've seen it in Weld County and other areas. I was one of the first ones in the San Luis Valley to install a center pivot irrigation system. That increased our irrigation efficiency by, you know, 75% compared to what we were doing before. So, Ronnie?
Just to add on, you mentioned the governor's forum on agriculture, which is taking place on February the 14th. Well, this year's theme is innovation and the importance of innovation and creativity to the future of agriculture. And that certainly goes with water as well. We talked about investment in new technology. There's no question that if we're going to meet the demands of growing population in the years ahead, with perhaps dwindling resources, greater demands for water and what have you, we're not only going to have to be efficient, but we're going to have to find new innovative ways to utilize that water, new innovative ways to irrigate, new innovative ways to do any number of things throughout agriculture to, you know, squeeze every drop of water that we can and maximize the efficiency, the effectiveness of every acre of land that we have out there involved in agriculture. So I think it happens to be a very timely topic this year in our Ag Forum with innovation, but clearly some technological advances in innovation would be a very important component, I think, of that answer as well.
And we also have in the afternoon, we have breakout sessions, and we have Justice Gregory Hobbs. He's a water expert in water history in the state of Colorado. And he's going to be doing two presentations in 2 different sessions. I've never sat through a course of his and gone to sleep, I promise you, even after lunch. It's so incredible to be able to listen how water was developed, all the way back from the Anasazi days and before, and how Colorado water law actually became what it is today here. Very interesting topic. Yes?
In line with the being creative in water, 2 things. For one, Is there
I'm
any
sorry, I'm a little hard of hearing because I've been on a tractor most of my life. And when I was a young and beginning farmer, we didn't have quiet cabs, we only had open cabs, and so I've lost a lot of my hearing.
We're told that there's cloud seeding going on to the west of us. Is there any law in process to try to regulate that so that we get the water that would naturally flow to Colorado? That's one thing. And the other question I have, are you aware of the status of the Million project that was bringing water from Wyoming into Colorado?
I am aware of the Million project. It's something that's very hard to say that you can support. I mean, if we can bring more water to Colorado, I'm all for it. The problem is the expense and trying to fight the environmental groups to make that happen. I think it'd be almost impossible. But I mean, it's possible. Anything's possible. As far as the cloud seeding, the Division of Natural Resources actually is the one that issues the permits for cloud seeding. And a lot of times, you know, they do issue those in compliance with state laws. I don't think that we have the authority to stop. The courts do, right, Ronnie? Probably the courts might, other states from doing cloud seeding, but I think anything that's seeded here in the state is meant to provide more water for, especially the urban areas, I would think. Yes, sir, Chuck?
I believe I can be heard. My wife always asks me just like I am now, we're talking too loud.
But she's got selective hearing, you know.
The water allocated for the endangered species, does it have priority or trump human life?
Does it have priority or trump human life? I think I could say, depending on what water attorney you have.
My definition of attorneys, they are this much under God for being perfect and doing everything right, but still they make mistakes.
I agree. I think that was more of a comment than a question. Even though my brother's an attorney, that's okay. I'm a poor dirt farmer, so I don't be proud of it. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Do you see education changing in this country for people to realize that food doesn't come from the grocery store? We shouldn't be watering our Kentucky bluegrass?
Well, you know, that's actually a very good question because that is our biggest challenge that we have in agriculture, is to try to educate our urban counterparts as to the importance of agriculture and to show them that if we don't have food in this country, we become a third world country because that is really all about national security. It keeps this country strong, but yet most people think you're exactly right. Let me tell you a story. When we were debating the 2008 Farm Bill in the committee in the evening, and of course the Ag Committee is like 40-some members strong, both Democrats and Republicans. But we were coming to the final stages. We were debating that in committee till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, and I remember one morning we're sitting there still fighting it out and arguing, and after we finished voting on the last amendment, we're leaving about 3 o'clock in the morning, and someone turns to me and says, "Hey, John," he said, "is it true that chocolate milk comes from brown cows?" And I turned to him and I said, "You're kidding, right?" He said, "No, that's what so-and-so told me, so that shows you how ignorant people are about where their food comes from." Seriously. When I was working for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, when I was a young and beginning farmer, I worked for what was then called the ASCS office, which is now the Farm Service Agency. And we used to have the wool program. You guys remember the wool program, wool incentive program back then? And I had an auditor from U.S. Department of Agriculture that was auditing our office, right? And he was pulling records and going over some of the records. And this is the wool incentive program, remember? And he said, "Hey, John, what's an iwi?" You, right? He was serious too. And he was the one that was doing the auditing, right? He had an accounting background. Anyway.
Let me just add just one thing with that, because you touch on a very important point about education, and how do those of us in agriculture talk to and inform and educate those who aren't. Let me give you an example, especially kind of ties into the question about the environment a moment ago. I was at a wedding last summer, and at the reception afterwards, you're doing what you do at receptions. You're talking and having drinks and just having a good time. And I knew the mother of the bride very well, and we were talking about whatever you talk about at weddings. And out of nowhere, she stopped and she said, "Well, agriculture is destroying the environment." And I came out of nowhere. I said, "Well, wow, what do you mean? How do you know that?" And she said, "Well, it just is. Everybody knows it." Well, at that point, you're at a wedding and you just sort of back off. You know when there's a fight and when not to fight. But the point is that there is a lot of misinformation out there about what happens in agriculture, where our food comes from, how it's produced, and how it's distributed. And we have a compelling story to tell. Okay, we have a very compelling story to tell about the great things that are happening in agriculture. And the trick, though, is just how do we get that information out there? How do we increase the educational awareness? Something we talk about in the department periodically, and I know there are other groups that do that as well. But it is something that I think all of us in agriculture struggle with. Is in fact, how do we combat misinformation? How do we get people to understand the true nature of what's happening in agriculture and in our rural communities? So it is an ongoing battle. It's just something that we're going to have to continue to work with.
You said that you were going to talk about the governor and what his position on water is. And then I don't know if you're aware, but the city of Fort Collins, which supplies a lot of water to the agriculture people in the north end of the town there, they decided not to do that this year, so there is no water. And they're trading their water at 1.5 to 1 to the CBT to get drinking water because of the High Park fire, which has put so much ash in the Poudre River that we have 3 to 4 feet over the gates that take water off the Poudre River and send it to different places like Greeley and that. And so I'm just wondering what the governor's position is in that region.
Well, anytime that you talk about drinking water, of course, that will always take priority over anything else. I mean, human life will actually take priority. That's simple. I mean, they can come and probably condemn my water on my farm if there's people that are dying of thirst in the city. I don't know specifically, and I would hesitate to respond to you as far as the governor's position on that, as far as what Fort Collins is doing. I know they're doing what they have to do. What the problem is this year, or last year, I mean, the water resources or snowpack was so low, it's one of the harshest, like I said, it's the harshest drought in 50 years that the whole state is in. And it's not only up here. I mean, in the San Luis Valley, for example, in one county we have 13 circles, 13 center pivot, that's me. Of those, I was only able to farm 4 this last year. So we're all suffering. I mean, it's not just an area by area thing in Colorado. I mean, it's a whole state. But I will ask the governor. I'll get back to you. If you leave me your name and number, I'll call you. Okay?
And that's exacerbated quite a bit. I know whether it's up in Larimer County or other places around the state. I was talking about the impacts of the drought, and one of the things that I neglected to mention, one of the impacts has been reservoir levels. The capacities have dropped significantly around the state, and then they continue to drop as well as groundwater and other And I know with Horsetooth, for example, that's an issue where the capacity has been drawn down quite a bit. So I know that plays into that. But that's one of the consequences of the drought are these situations. And of course, the Poudre River situation is exacerbated because of the fire, as you noted with the ash, and that's just added another element. Which, we didn't really talk about wildfires and forest fires, but when you do have excessive drought like this, that's just another hazard that you have, is the likelihood, quite frankly, of there being more fire situations, particularly where you have a lot of beetle kill, which is, a significant problem in large areas of Colorado. So,
Let me just finish off. I think we're out of time. What's our time?
We've got about 5 minutes.
5 minutes? Okay.
At the risk of sounding stupid, I'm not familiar, but why do they dock tails on Redtown? I don't know that.
Actually, this is a practice that has been worldwide. And one of the reasons is to manage disease issues. For example, if the tail gets really long, it drags in the manure, and then it happens to get the bacteria in the milk and things like that. It's a practice that really hasn't been practiced in Colorado. There's only one dairy in Colorado that practices that. My biggest concern, of course, if a bill like that goes through in Colorado, the mere perception that there could be a problem in Colorado could have a massive impact to our state economy. And let me tell you why. Because Leprino has built factories, and we have this huge demand for milk, okay? And let me tell you what's happened in California. Since 1990 till 2010, they have lost about half of their dairies in California due to excess and heavy regulation. Okay, if there's a perception in the state of Colorado that we have that kind of rules and regulations that are so heavy that they can't, the dairies that we need to come in to supply the milk for these factories, it's not going to happen. And so that's my biggest concern. And we have great hope for agriculture in Colorado. So we, like I said, there's no problem in Colorado. It's animal rights activists who are basically saying that it's cruelty to animals to dock their tail. But if that's the case, it's cruel to dock a puppy's tail, right? And, on sheep, they do it because it's necessary, right? I mean, you don't want the doodles hanging on the tail. It's simple. But if it's really about animal cruelty, then they should include all animals. Not just single out dairy cows, but that's an easy target for them. That really bothers them, right? We have
I'd like to go back to the water issue and just ask you where fracking, hydraulic fracturing for oil and gas drilling, the use of that water, where does that fit in relation to its priority level with, drinking water or irrigation or what? And how much water are they actually taking and using?
I don't know. It just depends on the development. But the issue here is that these oil and gas companies are able to buy, water rights that are already prioritized, that are part of the first in time, first in right, and so they have the right to use that water. But one of the things that's being talked about is that water can actually be recovered and clean and be able to be reused again is really critical. So I mean, they buy their own water rights. I know some cities have sold some water, which apparently they have excess water in some cities. We don't in agriculture, I know that. Okay?
Okay, yeah, thank you.
We have one more question. I think I have.
Mine is the same as his. I have one. I don't know if I need a microphone or not. Could I leave you with a final question? And I'm sorry, I'm going to have to read it.
A question or a thought?
Well, probably both in a sense. I don't know. It depends on your interpretation. But how, and maybe you've covered some of this, I don't know, but how will Colorado farmers produce the large quantity of egg products in this year with the current water projections that you had up on the screen in your program? They have limited water, well, you can figure it out.
Well,
You're the commissioner.
that's what I'm saying. What I talked about was that Colorado agriculture and net farm income is really dependent on the amount of moisture that we get up in the mountains. I hope that we have good runoff. Well, it's coming though. You know why? I asked my mother to pray. She's got a direct line to God. I know that she does. And so I'm really optimistic. Of course, you know, you guys are farmers, right? We're forever optimists. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't be in farming, I can assure you that. But it's going to be difficult. But like I said, again, we have to really invest in technology and try to figure out. The governor has, the water task force that I sit on, John Stolp, of course, is his waters are. And we've been working on trying to figure out how we can achieve a 50-year plan to be able to achieve the needs that we set up here. One of the suggestions that I've given him is this. We start out with like a balance sheet, right? So we know that we're going to need it on just a normal year. We're going to need 600,000 acre-feet of water. And so we start with that number up here. And then on one side we put the projects that might be in line to get accomplished and how each one of those can provide so much water, right? But we also have to have conservation as well as part of that formula, right? And so I suggested that if we use land use planning, we can actually conserve at least 200,000 acre-feet of that need, right? That will bring us to zero in that column. And then there's a lot of other projects that are on the drawing board. There's the NIST project, there's other projects, you know, that might be able to provide more additional water. And each one of those, the additional water that's provided, that comes off this 400,000 until you get to the point that is zero as far as a deficit, right? So the problem is, once again, any water project that is proposed is going to take years to accomplish just because of the environmental regulations, because of all the water returning to the state, and because of the competing interests in the state. So, you know, but we have to do a plan, and maybe we can attack one plan after another, and get those accomplished. The Arkansas Valley Conduit, I was able to finally, after 50 years, when President Kennedy signed that, the FRIARC project into law in 1963, the Arkansas Valley Conduit was supposed to provide water to the downstream users, right, of Pueblo on the Arkansas Basin, had never come to fruition. It was just an idea, but it was part of the requirement of that act in 1963. And I was able to actually start the initial funding when I was in Congress, and who knows if there's going to be additional funding coming. But 50 years later, it's finally coming to fruition. And that's how long it takes for water projects to be built. It's just tough. I mean, that's reality. You know that, Chuck? Mostly conservation. They mandated conservation, and that's how they got that done. But kids, you remember 26 gallons per person versus 120? And actually it's 170 in Colorado. I don't know where they got that from.
And also, I believe that they finally recognize the importance of using services around the combo and we're not doing that.
Debbie, I never read their study, but I mean, it was forced, actually came about because the legislature and the government actually forced them to do that. All right, thank you very much. I appreciate it.